Olivia Westbrook had always believed that love was an unnecessary distraction, something that could derail her carefully laid plans. At 28, she was already a rising star in the world of corporate consulting in New York, known for her sharp intellect, unshakable confidence, and relentless ambition. She had no time for romance. To her, relationships were cages, pretty, delicate cages, designed to clip a person's wings. Her success had come at the cost of countless sacrifices, each one reinforcing her belief that love was just another obstacle she didn't need in her life. But that all changed one fateful afternoon when she received a call from her mother, Margaret Westbrook. "Olivia, I need you to come home, right now." Her mother's voice crackled through the phone, laced with an unusual urgency. "It's important. Your father needs you." Olivia's eyebrows furrowed. "What's going on, Mom?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "It's urgent. Just come, please." Olivia hesitated. Her life was busy, and a flight to the Westbrook estate in New York would eat up precious hours. But something in her mother's voice made her stomach churn. It was rare for her mother to sound so frazzled. She closed her laptop with a sigh, booked the next flight out of JFK, and braced herself for whatever awaited her at home. When Olivia finally stepped onto the familiar grounds of the Westbrook estate, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling gnawing at her. The grand mansion loomed before her, a sprawling display of wealth and old money. She'd grown up in this house, but to her, it had always felt more like a museum, a place of polished perfection, where emotions took a back seat to appearances, and family was just another social contract. There had been no real love here, just duty and expectations. Her father, Gregory Westbrook, a well-respected business mogul, had always run the show, and her mother had dutifully followed. Their expectations for her were clear: be successful, be perfect, and never show weakness. Inside, the air felt different, heavier, almost suffocating. Her father, a stoic figure, sat in his favorite chair in the study, his stern expression unchanged by her arrival. Beside him stood her mother, her face unreadable. Olivia's heart raced. The moment she walked into the room, she could sense the change in the atmosphere. This was no ordinary conversation. "Olivia," her father said, his voice calm but sharp, as if he were addressing a business associate rather than his daughter, "you're finally here." Olivia folded her arms, her voice laced with sarcasm.
"Did I have a choice?"
Her mother hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice trembling slightly. "We've arranged for you to marry someone. It's important." Olivia's world stopped. "What? You're kidding, right?" Her laugh was bitter, laced with disbelief. She scanned her mother's face, waiting for the punchline. But it never came. Her father's gaze was cold and unwavering. "His name is Ethan Monroe," her father continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "He's the heir to one of the largest conglomerates in the country. If we don't secure this deal through marriage, everything we've built, the business, the family legacy, will be at risk." Olivia felt the floor drop beneath her. "So you're selling me off to secure a deal?" she asked, her voice cold, barely able to hide the anger rising in her chest. Her mother's eyes filled with pleading desperation. "Olivia, this is about survival, about the future of this family." Her father's expression hardened. "We don't have another option." Olivia stared at her parents, her world tilting on its axis. She had spent her entire life proving that she was more than just the daughter of wealthy parents, that she could stand on her own and make her own decisions. And now, in one conversation, they had taken it all away, reduced her to a pawn in their game of power. The anger swelled in her chest, but she fought to remain composed. There had to be another way out of this. There had to be. She excused herself, retreating to the solitude of her childhood bedroom, her mind racing with possible solutions. But every idea she came up with seemed impossible. Her father's influence stretched too far. Running away wouldn't work. She couldn't just vanish into thin air. Her father had already thought of that, covered every loophole. She had no choice but to play along. But not without a fight. A plan began to form. If she had to marry Ethan Monroe, then she would do it on her terms. She would not be some submissive, docile bride in a loveless arrangement. No, she would make her own rules. And if that meant making a spectacle of herself, then so be it. She would show them all that she wasn't going to be controlled. She would fight back. The night of the engagement party arrived, and Olivia felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her with each step she took through the grand halls of the Westbrook estate. The mansion, as always, exuded an air of wealth and status, but tonight it felt suffocating. Guests mingled in the sprawling ballroom, sipping champagne and discussing business deals as if the party were just another corporate event. Everything was polished, perfect. Yet to Olivia, it felt like a gilded cage. As her mother ushered her into the center of the room, Olivia caught her first glimpse of Ethan Monroe. He stood by the far wall, talking to a group of investors, his tall, broad figure commanding attention without effort. His sharp suit clung to his athletic frame, and his dark eyes scanned the room with a detached air, as though he was more observer than participant. Olivia felt a rush of revulsion. He seemed like exactly what she expected. The perfect business partner, the perfect heir to a fortune, and the perfect heir to a fortune, and the perfect man to fulfill her parents' ambitions. He was cold, calculated, and distant. Everything she despised. Her mother, Margaret, didn't give her a moment to breathe before guiding her toward Ethan. "Olivia," she said with a practiced smile, "this is Ethan Monroe, your future husband." The words hit Olivia like a punch to the gut, though she knew they were coming. Ethan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. His handshake was firm but not warm, and his lips curled into a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Olivia," he said smoothly, his voice deep and steady, "it's a pleasure." The pleasantries felt empty, hollow. Olivia studied him for a moment, feeling a strange mix of anger and disbelief. This man, who barely acknowledged her presence, was the one her family had chosen to secure their legacy. She resisted the urge to scowl. Likewise, Olivia replied, her voice cold. She studied him more closely, trying to catch any hint of emotion behind his perfect mask. But there was nothing, just same icy professionalism that had been drilled into him from a young age. He wasn't the least bit intimidated by her presence, nor did he seem interested in getting to know her. To him, this was just another business transaction, another deal to secure. As the night wore on, Olivia couldn't help but notice the way Ethan interacted with the guests. He was a master of charm, moving through the crowd with effortless ease, engaging in conversation, always calm, collected, and just a little too perfect. He never faltered, never seemed anything less than in control. It was a game to him, Olivia realized. A game of power, of control, and she was just another pawn in it. Her frustration simmered beneath the surface. She had always prided herself on being able to handle any situation, to never let anything, or anyone, shake her composure. But tonight, something about Ethan's smug confidence, his disinterest in her, was getting under her skin. The more he detached himself, the more determined she became to make him notice her, to make him realize that she wouldn't just fall in line like everyone else. So, when the moment came for them to share their first dance, Olivia took a deep breath and walked into the spotlight, putting on the best mask of confidence she could muster. Ethan, ever the professional, led her onto the dance floor, his hand resting lightly on her waist. His touch was formal, almost mechanical, and Olivia couldn't help but feel the tension between them. "This is what your parents want, isn't it?" Olivia asked, her voice low, but with an edge of challenge. She refused to play the docile fiancée that everyone expected her to be. Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This is what your parents want," he corrected smoothly. "Not what I want." Olivia's pulse quickened at his admission. "Then, why go through with it?" She shot back. "Why pretend?" He met her gaze then, his expression unreadable. "Because sometimes you do what needs to be done," he said simply, "even if it's not what you want." She stared at him, a mixture of anger and disbelief churning inside her. She had always been the one in control of her life, the one who made her own decisions. But here, with Ethan Monroe leading her in a dance that felt more like a business deal than anything else, she realized how little control she had. The idea of marrying him, of being forced into a future she didn't want, was suffocating. For the rest of the evening, she played the part, offering polite smiles and engaging in forced conversation, but her mind was racing. She had never imagined her life would come to this, arranged, calculated, controlled. Ethan Monroe might not care about her, but she wasn't going to make this easy for him. She wasn't going to let him get away with thinking she was just another asset to be used for business purposes. As the night wore on, and the guests slowly began to trickle out, Olivia's thoughts were clouded with frustration. Ethan had made it clear that he saw this engagement as nothing more than an obligation, a transaction, but she wasn't about to let him win. No, she would fight back. This marriage, this engagement, wasn't going to define her. She would find a way to take back control, even if it meant tearing down the walls they were both hiding behind. Olivia's frustration reached a boiling point in the weeks following the engagement party. Every time she saw Ethan's face, every time he smiled that detached, professional smile, she could feel her anger simmering beneath the surface. He never let anything faze him. He was calm, collected, and always in control. But for Olivia, it was different. She was suffocating in this marriage arrangement, and the more she resisted, the more Ethan seemed to challenge her at every turn. At first, she had tried to outmaneuver him. She made herself scarce, spoke to him as little as possible, and even made jabs at him whenever she had the chance. But Ethan was a master at keeping his emotions in check, and nothing seemed to rattle him. He didn't bite when she tried to push his buttons. Instead, he would nod politely, shoot her a knowing look, and continue with whatever conversation or task they were supposed to be doing. That irritated her even more. Why couldn't he just lose his temper, show some vulnerability? Anything that would let her know that he was just as trapped in this situation as she was. But nothing. Not a flicker. Ethan Monroe was a man of stone, and Olivia was starting to wonder if anyone could ever crack him. One evening, as they were both attending yet another gala thrown by their families in the hopes of solidifying the marriage deal with endless business partners, Olivia found herself on the verge of a meltdown. The opulent ballroom sparkled with the glow of crystal chandeliers. The murmur of polite conversations filled the air, and everywhere she looked, she saw people exchanging smiles that barely masked the transactional nature of their relationships. Olivia couldn't breathe in here. She felt like she was slowly suffocating, her life, her future, all slipping through her fingers. Ethan was by her side, as always, the picture of grace and elegance. As they made their way through the room, he spoke with various figures of influence, his hand casually resting at the small of her back, guiding her with a gentle, yet firm touch. The gesture was meant to signify their unity, but to Olivia, it felt like a shackle, an invisible chain linking them together in a contract that she never signed. "You look like you're about to implode," Ethan said, his voice low, barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Olivia shot him a sharp look, her lips tight. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone clipped, though the words felt hollow. She was anything but fine. She was angry. Angry at him. Angry at her parents. Angry at her parents. Angry at herself for letting it get this far. Everything she had worked for, her independence, her freedom, her dreams, seemed to be slipping away, replaced by this cold, calculated arrangement. Ethan gave her a small, knowing smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You can pretend as much as you want, Olivia. But we both know that's not the truth." That was the moment she snapped. "I don't need your sympathy, Ethan," she spat, her voice rising slightly, making a few heads turn in their direction. "You think this is easy for me? You think this is easy for me? You think I enjoy playing the part of the dutiful fiancé, grinning and bearing it for the sake of your precious business deal?" Ethan's expression didn't change, though his jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. He let out a slow breath, then leaned in closer to her, his lips brushing her ear. "No, but I think it's harder for you than it is for me. You hate it, don't you? You hate that you're trapped, that you're being forced into this life, this role that you never wanted, and you hate that, no matter what you do, you can't escape it. You can't escape it. You can't escape me." Olivia's heart skipped a beat at his words, and for a brief moment, she felt exposed, like he had stripped away the walls she had so carefully built around herself. Her breath caught in her throat. The worst part was, he was right. Every moment she spent with him made her question everything she had believed in. The anger she had been holding on to, the walls she had built to protect herself. He was wearing them down, piece by piece. Before she could respond, Ethan stepped back, his demeanor calm again, the smirk fading into something unreadable. "You're not the only one who feels trapped here, Olivia. You're not the only one who feels trapped here, Olivia," he added quietly, almost as an afterthought. "But this is what we've been dealt, and we'll have to make the best of it." His words echoed in her mind long after they parted ways for the evening, lingering in her thoughts like a persistent whisper. She didn't want to admit it, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized how true it was. Ethan wasn't the only one stuck in this arrangement. She had made the choice to fight it, to resist it, but in the process, she had made herself a prisoner to her own emotions. The next few days were a blur of tense conversations and silent standoffs. Ethan had stopped playing the game of resistance, and so had she, for the most part. But the cracks in her armor were starting to show. The more she saw him, the more she started to see a different side of him, one that wasn't just a businessman or a puppet of his family's expectations. She began to realize that Ethan was more than just the cold, calculating figure she had first thought him to be. He was a man who had been shaped by circumstances, much like her. And slowly but surely, she started to wonder if there was more to him, more to this engagement, than she had ever imagined. But admitting that would mean surrendering to something she was terrified of. The possibility of real, genuine connection with Ethan Monroe. The days following their heated exchange were tense and fraught, with an unspoken understanding between Olivia and Ethan. It was as if, in the midst of their bickering and stubborn defiance, something had shifted. An invisible line had been crossed, but neither of them was willing to acknowledge it just yet. Olivia, in particular, felt the sharp sting of her growing confusion. She had spent so long building walls around herself, guarding against vulnerability and intimacy, only to find those walls slowly crumbling, piece by piece. And the person who was tearing them down wasn't her family, or even her parents' expectations. It was Ethan Monroe. Over the next few weeks, Olivia found herself thinking about him more often than she cared to admit. It wasn't just his cold, calculating demeanor anymore. No, it was the small moments that lingered in her mind. The brief glances, the way he had spoken so honestly when they'd had that argument at the gala. The words he'd said were still ringing in her ears. You're not the only one who feels trapped here. There was truth in that. Maybe she hadn't been the only one caged by family obligations. Ethan was trapped too, in his own way. But for the first time, Olivia was beginning to understand just how much. Their interactions over the next few days were different. Less combative, yet still tense. She could feel the subtle change in the air whenever they were together. She couldn't help but notice how he seemed to soften around her, his sharp edges slowly dulling with every conversation, every shared moment. And to her surprise, she found herself responding in kind. His presence no longer felt like a constant reminder of her resentment, but something more complex. Ethan was still Ethan, still the stoic businessman, the heir to a dynasty, still the man she was supposed to marry for all the wrong reasons. But there was a depth to him now that she hadn't seen before. One evening, as they sat in a private room at the Westbrook estate, Olivia felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. It was rare for her to find peace in a place like this. But tonight, something had shifted. She was looking at Ethan, really looking at him, when she noticed the faintest signs of exhaustion in his Austin. He has always been so composed, so in control, but tonight his guard was down, and it made him seem human. Olivia hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Ethan, why do you keep going through with this?" she asked, her words uncharacteristically vulnerable. "You don't have to do this, you know. If it's all just a business deal, why keep pretending? Why bother?" Ethan met her gaze, his expression unreadable at first. But then he sighed deeply, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Because sometimes, Olivia, you don't have a choice. It's not about pretending. It's about doing what needs to be done. You might not understand it now, but you will. His words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Olivia felt the weight of their shared predicament. This wasn't just about family legacy or business deals. It was about survival on both their parts. They were both pawns in a much larger game, and they had little control over the rules. And yet, in this moment, something changed. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, something he had never shown before. He wasn't just the cold, calculating man she had first judged him to be. He was more than that. Ethan was trapped, much like her. Olivia swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't want to be trapped anymore," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to be controlled by my parents, by you, by any of this." Ethan's gaze softened, his features relaxing as he reached across the table to take her hand. "You don't have to be, Olivia," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I'm not here to control you. We're both stuck in this, but we can figure it out. Together." Her breath hitched, and for the first time in weeks, Olivia allowed herself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than she'd ever imagined. Maybe Ethan wasn't the enemy. Maybe he was her ally, even if they didn't fully understand each other yet. She wasn't sure if she could trust him completely, but in that moment, she realized that she didn't have to fight him anymore. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. And for the first time since this engagement began, Olivia felt a strange sense of hope creeping into her heart. There was something about Ethan Monroe that was starting to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, love wasn't as far out of reach as she had once thought. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But for the first time, Olivia allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something real. And that scared her more than anything else. The days following their quiet conversation held a strange sort of tension between Olivia and Ethan. Something had shifted between them. Something intangible, yet undeniable. As much as Olivia wanted to push it aside, to retreat back into her fortress of defiance, she couldn't ignore the softening in the air every time Ethan was near. His cool detachment was slowly giving way to something more personal, more real, and she found herself drawn to it in ways she couldn't explain. It was frustrating. It was frustrating. Olivia had never been someone to fall for anyone. Olivia had never been someone to fall for anyone. But the more time she spent with him, the more she realized that he wasn't the cold, calculating figure she'd imagined him to be. There was a vulnerability beneath the surface, and she found herself compelled to understand it. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Olivia couldn't help but notice the exhaustion in Ethan's eyes. He had been working non-stop, always keeping his mind sharp, always keeping his mind sharp, always the picture of perfect composure. But tonight, there was something different. His usual effortless charm was gone, replaced by a weariness that spoke of far too many sleepless nights spent trying to hold everything together. The weight of their family's expectations, the pressure of the deal, the growing tension between them. It was all starting to take a toll. "Ethan," Olivia said, her voice soft, her words taking her by surprise. She hadn't intended to speak her thoughts aloud, but something in his tired eyes made her want to reach out. "You don't have to do this." Ethan looked up from his plate, his eyebrows slightly furrowed. "Do what?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. "This. The whole engagement. The marriage," she said, her fingers twisting around the edge of her wine glass. "You've been under so much pressure. We both have. And yet, here we are, pretending like everything's fine when it's not." For a long moment, Ethan didn't speak. His gaze lingered on her, but there was no trace of the man who had once seemed so distant. In his eyes, she saw something unexpected. A flicker of understanding, a recognition that they were both caught in a tangled web of obligations and expectations. His lips parted, and for the first time, his voice was filled with something more than duty. "You're right," he finally said, his tone surprisingly raw. "It's not fine. But sometimes, Olivia, we don't get to choose the path we walk. Sometimes, the things that matter most aren't the things we would choose for ourselves." She couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Ethan had always been so composed, so in control, and yet here he was, opening up to her in a way that she hadn't expected. It felt like a shift, a moment of vulnerability that had been brewing beneath the surface for longer than either of them had realized. "I never asked for this," Olivia admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "This marriage, this life, all of it. It's like I'm losing myself in all of it. I don't know how to get out." "You're not losing yourself," Ethan said, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of emotion. "But I understand what you mean. This isn't what I would have chosen either. If I had a choice, I'd be free of all of this too." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But we're both in this together now. And maybe, just maybe, we can figure out how to make it work. Not for our families. Not for anyone else. But for us." Olivia felt a strange weight lift off her shoulders at his words. She had spent so long fighting against this engagement, fighting against him, that she hadn't stopped to consider the possibility of a different kind of partnership. A partnership where they didn't have to pretend anymore. Where they could support each other, not as business partners or pawns in their family's games, but as two people who were truly in this together. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart race. "I don't know what this is, Ethan," she said, the words coming out quietly, "but I'm not sure I can keep pretending like I'm okay with everything. I don't want to be part of a deal anymore. I don't want to be part of a deal anymore. I want something real." Ethan's eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something close to tenderness in his gaze. He reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. "I don't want a deal either," he said, his voice low and sincere. I don't want to be trapped in something that isn't real. I don't want you to feel trapped either. So let's figure this out, together." The moment stretched between them, and Olivia felt her heart racing in her chest. She had spent so long guarding herself, so long refusing to allow anyone to get close. But in Ethan's eyes, she saw a reflection of her own longing for something more, something real. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this arrangement didn't have to be a cage after all. Ethan Monroe was no longer just a man she had to marry for business. He was becoming something else entirely. And as she squeezed his hand, a spark of hope ignited deep within her. The weeks that followed were a strange, quiet sort of tension between Olivia and Ethan. They had crossed a line, one neither of them had anticipated, and now neither knew exactly where they stood. There were moments of understanding, where they exchanged brief glances that said more than words ever could, but there were also silences that stretched for what felt like hours, as though they were both afraid to take that final step forward. Olivia had long told herself she could handle this engagement, that she was strong enough to withstand anything. But now, as she spent more time with Ethan, her resolve began to crack. The night everything changed came unexpectedly. Olivia had been waiting for Ethan in the study, her mind clouded with the constant pressure of her family's expectations. The weight of their legacy, of the contract she was bound to, pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. She had hoped that time, distance, and more work would numb the sting of the engagement. But instead, it had only sharpened her feelings. Ethan walked in, looking as composed as ever. But there was something in his eyes that made Olivia's stomach tighten. He wasn't just the corporate heir, the man she was supposed to marry. He seemed to be fighting his own battle. And it was in that moment that she realized just how much they were both caught in this web of their family's making. "Olivia," he said, his voice holding a rare softness, "we need to talk." She looked up from her papers, meeting his gaze. The calm facade he wore had slipped for just a moment, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. She hadn't expected it. She didn't want to admit it, but seeing him like this, as uncertain and worn down as she was, stirred something inside her. "What's going on?" Olivia asked, trying to keep her voice steady. She couldn't show him how much this conversation had already unsettled her. Ethan leaned against the desk, folding his arms. His usual composure was now replaced with a weariness that reflected in his posture. "I've been talking to my father," he began, his tone carefully measured, "and I found out something I wasn't supposed to know." He hesitated for a moment, his gaze dropping before meeting hers again. "They're planning to have me sign a deal that will bind me to this merger, to this marriage, without giving me a choice." Olivia's heart pounded as she processed his words. She had known from the beginning that their families had orchestrated this entire engagement to secure a business deal, but hearing it from Ethan, hearing the defeat in his voice, hit her harder than she had expected. He was just as trapped as she was. "What does that mean for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid of what he might say next. "It means that everything we've been doing, the dinners, the appearances, the engagement, it's all a facade," Ethan replied, his words coming faster now, as if the pressure had finally reached its breaking point. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep up with the game, but I can't. I'm not sure I ever could." The weight of his confession hung in the air between them. Olivia stood frozen, her mind racing. She had been so caught up in her own feelings of betrayal and frustration that she hadn't considered Ethan's side of the story. They were both pieces on a chessboard, moving at the whims of their families. And somewhere along the way, they had both forgotten to ask what they wanted. "I'm not going to go through with this," Ethan said suddenly, his voice hardening with newfound determination. "I won't let my father, or anyone, make decisions for me anymore. Not when it comes to my future. Not when it comes to my future. Not when it comes to you. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She had spent so long resisting, so long hating the idea of being forced into this, that she hadn't stopped to consider what would happen if they actually stopped pretending. What if they chose something else? What if they decided, together, that they didn't have to be bound by their family's expectations? "You're not the only one who's been fighting this," Olivia said, her voice trembling with the weight of her own truth. "I've been pretending too, acting like I'm okay with this, acting like I'm okay with this, acting like I'm okay with you, but I'm not, Ethan, I'm not." Ethan moved toward her slowly, his hand reaching out as if unsure of how she would react. But this time, there was no distance between them, no cold formalities. There was only the raw honesty they had been hiding from each other for so long. His hand found hers, the warmth of his touch sending a surge of emotion rushing through Olivia. "I don't want to lose you," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible. The words hung in the space between them, and for the first time, Olivia felt her heart loosen, just a little. It wasn't a confession she had expected to hear from him, but in this moment, it was everything. She had spent so much time fighting against this marriage, fighting against him, that she hadn't realized how much she needed him to fight for it too. "I don't want to lose you either," she whispered back, her heart finally allowing itself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth fighting for between them. In that moment, everything shifted. The tangled web of obligations, the suffocating expectations, all seemed to fall away as they stood there, hands intertwined, ready to face whatever came next. Not as pawns, but as partners. It was a terrifying thought, but it was also the most freeing one she had ever had. Together, they could rewrite their own story. Together, they could choose what came next. And for the first time, Olivia realized she wasn't alone in this fight anymore. They both had a choice. And that choice was each other. Olivia sat in the quiet of her apartment, the weight of everything pressing down on her like a storm cloud she couldn't shake. The wedding day was fast approaching, and as the final days ticked by, she felt herself caught in a whirlpool of emotions. She had spent weeks telling herself that this marriage was just a business deal, just a contract she had to fulfill to appease her family and secure her future. But now, standing at the precipice of the life she had been forced into, she was no longer sure what she was fighting for. She was no longer sure what she was fighting for. Her resolve, which had once been ironclad, was beginning to crumble in the face of something far more complicated than a mere arrangement. The thought of the wedding itself made her stomach churn. The dress, the flowers, the formalities, everything about the day felt like a performance. It was a show for their families, their businesses, the world. She wasn't marrying Ethan because she loved him. She was marrying him because it was expected. She was marrying him because her father had told her to, because her mother had told her to, because everything she had built up to, because everything she had built up to this point in her life was at risk if she didn't play along. And yet, the more Olivia tried to push the feelings away, the more she realized that this wasn't just a business deal anymore. The lines had blurred. Ethan had stopped being just the man she was forced to marry, and had started to become someone she saw differently. Someone she started to care about. The vulnerability he had shown her in their quiet moments. The honesty in his voice. When they finally opened up to each other. It had changed everything. The night before the wedding, Olivia found herself in the study, pacing the floor. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the soft tapping of her heels on the hardwood floor. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman she barely recognized anymore. Strong, driven, ambitious, but also vulnerable, uncertain. Her heart ached as she stared at the dress hanging in the corner, the ivory lace that she would wear the next day. The dress, a symbol of everything she had fought against, was now a symbol of everything she feared. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. It was Ethan. His voice, calm and steady, filtered through the door. "Olivia, can we talk?" She opened the door to find him standing there looking every bit the part of the perfect groom. His black tuxedo, sharp and precise, only served to emphasize the tension in his shoulders, the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and unspoken worries. He was always composed, always in control. But tonight, there was a crack in his armor. "What is it, Ethan?" she asked, her voice betraying the exhaustion she felt. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay," he said, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "This is a lot for both of us, and I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this." Her heart stuttered in her chest. For all the walls she had put up, for all the anger she had harbored toward him, this was the moment where everything shifted again. He wasn't just the man she was forced to marry. He wasn't just the man she was forced to marry. He was a man who understood the weight of it all. "I'm not sure I can do this," Olivia whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm not sure I can go through with the wedding tomorrow. It feels like I'm losing myself in all of this. This isn't what I wanted, Ethan." Ethan stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. "You're not losing yourself," he said softly. "But I understand what you mean. This isn't what we both wanted, but it's what we've been given. And maybe that's what makes this different from everything else. We have a choice now. We can choose to make something of this. We can choose to make it our own." Her pulse quickened as his words sank in. The walls she had so carefully constructed, walls built out of pride, anger, and defiance, seemed to crumble around her in that moment. She had spent so much time fighting him, fighting their circumstances, fighting everything that was being forced upon her. But now, for the first time, she realized that maybe she didn't have to fight. Maybe she didn't have to do this alone. "I don't know what to do anymore," Olivia admitted, the tears she had been holding back finally falling free. "I thought I had everything figured out, but now I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know what I want." Ethan's hand cupped her cheek gently, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to know all the answers right now," he said, his voice low. "I'm here. We'll figure it out, together." The words, simple as they were, carried a weight Olivia hadn't realized she needed. In that moment, something shifted within her. The weight of the world, the pressure of the wedding, the expectations of her family. It all seemed to fade into the background. She wasn't just marrying Ethan for a deal anymore. She was marrying him because, for the first time in her life, she wasn't facing the world alone. The next day, when Olivia walked down the aisle, she wasn't just walking toward the man she was expected to marry. She was walking toward a future, uncertain but real, with someone who had shown her that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this life than duty and expectation. She wasn't just saying "I do" to a contract anymore. She was saying "I do" to a chance at something she had never allowed herself to believe in. A future with love, a future with Ethan. The wedding was a blur of faces, of smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, of polite conversations laced with thinly veiled expectations. The grand cathedral, bathed in the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, was filled with well-dressed guests, whose eyes followed Olivia with a scrutiny that felt like a weight on her shoulders. She had been walking down this path for what felt like an eternity, dressing up for the occasion, playing the role of the perfect daughter, the perfect fiancée. Today, however, was different. It wasn't just another performance. This was the day that would decide everything, or so she had been told. It was supposed to be the culmination of her sacrifice, of her obedience. But instead, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated. As she walked toward the altar, she kept her gaze fixed on the ground, focusing on each step. She couldn't look at Ethan yet. She didn't know what to think anymore. She didn't know what to think anymore. Everything she had believed about their marriage, about him, had changed in the last few days. The walls she had built between them, the anger, the resentment, they were crumbling faster than she could control. and yet she still didn't know if she could trust herself, if she could trust the emotions that were beginning to stir inside her. Was it love? Was it just relief? She couldn't tell. When she reached the altar, Ethan stood waiting for her, his eyes locked on hers, but there was something different about his gaze now. He wasn't the distant man she had once seen him as, just another player in a game too large for either of them to escape. There was something more now, a recognition in his eyes, an understanding. It wasn't just about business anymore, and it hadn't been for a long time. For better or worse, they were both in this together. She had fought it at first, but now she couldn't help but wonder if they could make it work. Could they? Could they take this tangled mess of duty and expectation and somehow find something real in it? The priest's voice echoed through the cathedral as he asked the fateful question, and Olivia felt her heart race. Do you, Olivia Westbrook, take Ethan Monroe to be your lawfully wedded husband? It was the question she had been dreading, the moment that would tie her, body and soul, to someone she had spent months trying to avoid. She opened her mouth to answer, but it was as if the words caught in her throat. What was she supposed to say? Ethan's gaze softened, and she could see the question in his eyes too, one of uncertainty, one of hope. He was giving her the space, the opportunity to decide. For the first time in their entire engagement, she felt like she wasn't being forced into something. It was her choice, her decision, her future. She wasn't bound by anyone else's expectations. Not anymore. Her heart hammered in her chest, and suddenly, everything she had been holding back, everything she had tried to suppress, bubbled to the surface. The love she had been too afraid to admit to herself, the care she had begun to feel for Ethan, the connection that had developed between them. It was all there, raw and real. She could see it in the way he looked at her, in the way he looked at her, in the way his hand, slightly trembling, reached for hers. I do, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but firm with conviction. She wasn't just marrying him for the sake of the contract anymore. She wasn't just fulfilling an obligation. She was marrying him because she wanted to. She had spent so long resisting it, so long hiding behind the walls of her own making. But here she was, ready to let go of the past and embrace whatever came next. The applause that followed seemed distant, almost irrelevant in that moment. As Ethan pulled her toward him and kissed her, Olivia didn't feel the weight of the room, the pressure of the eyes on them. All she could feel was the warmth of his lips against hers, the promise of something new and unspoken. They walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, ready to face the world, not as two people bound by duty, but as two people who had chosen each other, who had chosen each other, who had chosen to fight for something real. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, doubts, and moments of fear. But for the first time in her life, Olivia felt like she had made the right choice. She wasn't alone anymore. And for all the uncertainty that the future held, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Together, they would figure it out. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a partnership. It was a chance at something real. And for Olivia, that was more than she had ever dared hope for. The weeks that followed the wedding were a whirlwind, but in a way that Olivia had never experienced before. Everything had changed. Nothing was the same, and yet, somehow, it felt like everything was just beginning. She had stepped into this marriage with so much fear, so much doubt, and now, those emotions were slowly being replaced with something unexpected. Hope, but hope was a slippery thing, and Olivia wasn't sure if she could fully trust it just yet. Living with Ethan in the grand penthouse, that was now their home, had brought with it a strange new kind of intimacy. At first, Olivia had kept her distance, not wanting to let herself get too close to him. The walls she had so carefully built were still there, albeit less rigid. Ethan, however, was proving to be a force she couldn't easily ignore. He was gentle, attentive, and somehow, in all his calm composure, he was the one person who truly seemed to understand her. He never pushed too hard, never demanded more than she was willing to give. But his presence, his quiet strength, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, there was something real between them. One evening, after a long day of meetings and endless phone calls, Ethan was waiting for her in the living room, his back casually resting against the arm of the couch, a glass of whiskey in his hand. It was a familiar scene by now, one Olivia had grown used to. But tonight something was different. There was a subtle shift in the way he looked at her when she entered, an unspoken question in his eyes. His gaze softened when she met it, and she couldn't help but feel a pull, a connection that was undeniable. "You're late," Ethan remarked, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. But it wasn't the teasing, playful smirk she had grown accustomed to. It was something deeper, something that made her heart beat a little faster. "I had a lot to wrap up," she replied, shrugging off her coat and tossing it over the back of the chair. She felt the familiar sense of exhaustion creeping in, but didn't want to show it. She had spent the last few weeks pretending to be unaffected, pretending that nothing about their arrangement had started to chip away at her resolve. But in this moment, as Ethan's eyes lingered on her with that quiet intensity, she realized just how much she had been hiding. Ethan set his drink down and stood up, taking a step toward her. "You're always busy," he said softly, his voice lower than usual. "Always running from something. What's it going to take for you to stop?" The question caught her off guard. It wasn't like Ethan to ask such personal things, to probe her thoughts so deeply. She met his gaze, wondering if she could allow herself to answer him honestly. Could she admit to him what she had never allowed herself to say? That she was afraid of everything, of her family's expectations, of her own feelings, of the fact that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to care about him in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I'm not running," she said quickly. But even to her own ears, it sounded like a lie. She could see the flicker of something in Ethan's eyes, a mixture of understanding and concern. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice gentle but persistent. "Because you're always so guarded, Olivia. You've spent your whole life building walls. But I'm here now. You don't have to do this alone." The words landed heavier than she expected. She wanted to protest, to insist that she didn't need anyone, that she was fine on her own. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't fine, and Ethan, in his quiet way, was the one person who had started to break through the walls she had spent so long constructing. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel vulnerable. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Ethan," she confessed. "I'm scared of letting go, scared of what happens if I do." Ethan's hand gently cupped her cheek, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to be scared anymore. Not with me." His voice was so sincere, so steady, that Olivia felt herself falter. She wasn't sure what this was between them, but in this moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she wasn't alone. They weren't alone. Slowly, almost as if it was the most natural thing in the world, Ethan leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't the fiery passion she had expected, nor was it the forced affection of a contractual marriage. It was soft, tentative, but it was real. And in that kiss, Olivia realized that the fear she had been carrying, fear of commitment, fear of vulnerability, fear of the unknown, was slowly beginning to fade. They pulled away just enough for their foreheads to touch, and for the first time in a long time, Olivia felt like she could breathe. She wasn't sure what the future held for them, but she knew that together, they could face it. They could make it work, whatever it was. "Let's take this one step at a time," Ethan murmured, his hand still resting gently against her cheek. Olivia nodded, a soft smile tugging at the corner of her lips. For the first time in her life, she was ready to take that step. With Ethan by her side, she knew they would figure out the rest together. The tension between Olivia and Ethan had grown over the weeks. Their marriage, initially a mere formality, something to be endured, was slowly morphing into something neither of them had expected. The underlying friction that had simmered beneath the surface since their wedding day was no longer just about business deals or family legacies. It was becoming personal. The world they had created, a shared space filled with moments of genuine connection, began to shift, and with it came an unexpected realization. They weren't as trapped as they had once believed. It wasn't an easy transition. They both had been so used to keeping their feelings buried under layers of defense and pride. Yet, as they navigated through these uncharted waters, each passing day seemed to chip away at the walls they had built around themselves. But that didn't mean everything was smooth sailing. In fact, the more they got closer, the more they realized how much they had to learn about each other. Trust, vulnerability, and emotional openness became the battlegrounds. And yet, there was something undeniable between them. Something that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge for so long. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and back-to-back conference calls, Ethan came home to find Olivia sitting by the window, staring out at the city skyline. The glow of the sunset bathed the room in soft, golden hues, casting a peaceful light on her otherwise tense posture. He had seen her like this before, detached, closed off, lost in her own thoughts. Detached, closed off, lost in her own thoughts. But tonight, something was different. The usual deflection, the calm mask she always wore, was nowhere to be found. Instead, she looked vulnerable, almost fragile, as if she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Olivia," Ethan said softly, his voice breaking the stillness of the room. She turned to face him, her eyes tired but sharp. "About what?" she asked, her voice tight, almost defensive. The distance between them felt tangible, as if she had pulled back from him, perhaps too far. "I don't want to keep pretending," Ethan replied, his words raw, unfiltered. "Not anymore. I don't want to pretend that everything's fine when it's not. We're both living a lie, and it's suffocating me." Olivia swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She had known this moment was coming. The moment where all their pent-up frustrations would come to the surface. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she could handle this arrangement, that it was just another chapter in her carefully planned life. But now, facing Ethan's vulnerability, she realized how hollow that narrative had become. "I never wanted this," Olivia admitted, her voice shaky. "I never wanted to be part of this world, this game. I didn't ask for this life, for this marriage. And yet, here I am. And yet, here I am. And I don't know what to do with all these feelings." Her words hung in the air between them, thick with unsaid. Ethan's gaze softened, his hand reaching for hers across the table. The touch was gentle, tentative, but it sent a shock through her. A reminder that things were changing. That he was changing. "You don't have to have it all figured out," Ethan said quietly. "We don't have to know everything right now. But I think we've both been holding back, pretending like we don't care. But I do care, Olivia. I care about you. And I think you care about me too." His words hit her like a wave, a crash of emotions that she had tried so desperately to keep under control. She felt her heart race as his words sank in, the truth of them undeniable. She wanted to deny it, to push him away, to stay in control, but in that moment she realized that she couldn't anymore. The walls she had spent so long building, the barriers between them, had come down. "I don't know what this is, Ethan," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know where we go from here, but I know one thing. I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you. A quiet, but genuine smile tugged at the corners of Ethan's lips. He squeezed her hand gently. Then we'll figure it out. For the first time since their marriage had started, Olivia didn't feel like she was trapped in a cage. She wasn't bound by duty, by obligation, or by the weight of their family's expectations. What they had was real, raw, unspoken, but real, and it was enough for now. The future was still uncertain, but in that moment, standing by his side, Olivia realized that she didn't have to face it alone. The truth was, they both had been running from the idea of what they could be, running from the possibility of vulnerability, of letting go. But now, they were standing on the edge of something new, something undefined, and for the first time in her life, Olivia felt like she was ready to jump. With Ethan by her side, the future didn't seem so terrifying anymore. Together, they could face it. And for the first time, Olivia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The evening of their first official event after the wedding arrived, and Olivia found herself standing in front of a full-length mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman she didn't fully recognize. The wedding had been a blur, a performance that they had both played their parts in perfectly, and now this was another part of the show, another round of proving to the world that they were the perfect power couple. Her dress, a shimmering silver gown that clung to her frame in all the right places, felt like armor. Yet, despite the beauty of the event, the elegance of the ballroom, and the politeness of the ballroom, and the politeness of the guests around her, Olivia couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. Every smile felt forced. Every handshake felt too tight, and her eyes kept drifting toward Ethan, who stood at the center of the room, talking to a group of executives with his usual charm. He seemed perfectly at ease, as though the weight of their arrangement, of everything they had become, didn't bother him at all. It frustrated her. In the week since the wedding, she'd been fighting her own internal war. The distance she had kept between them was slowly eroding, but the fact remained that this marriage had been born out of obligation, not love. But somehow, in the small moments they had shared in private, she had begun to see Ethan in a different light. He wasn't just the man she had to marry for business reasons. He was kind, protective, attentive, and the strangest thing, she was starting to feel something real for him, something she had tried so hard to suppress. The kiss they shared in their apartment after their heart had left her shaken in the best way. Yet, here she was, standing in a room filled with people who didn't care about the truth of their marriage, who didn't care about what had transpired between them. They just saw them as a power move, a way to solidify business deals. Olivia, a voice broke through her thoughts. It was Ethan, stepping up behind her, his presence warm and commanding. "You look stunning." She turned to face him, meeting his gaze, but there was something in his eyes tonight, something different. A flicker of the vulnerability he had shown her during their more personal moments. A tenderness she wasn't used to seeing in the calculating, driven businessman he portrayed to the world. "Thank you," Olivia replied, her voice softer than she expected. She couldn't help but feel that strange pull toward him again. "You look good yourself," she added with a small, playful smile, trying to mask the confusion swirling inside her. He reached out and gently touched her arm. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "You seem distant." It was the first time he had noticed. She had been so careful, so guarded, but in that one small gesture, Ethan showed her that he saw through the act she had been putting on. Olivia paused, debating whether to open up, to admit the truth that she wasn't okay, that the weight of their marriage, the constant pressure to perform, was wearing on her. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. Not here. Not with everyone watching. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile. "Just tired. You know how it is?" Ethan didn't buy it. "If you say so," he said, but his expression didn't waver. He wasn't letting her off that easy. Still, before she could respond, he turned his attention to the crowd, guiding her with a gentle touch on her lower back as they walked into the heart of the ballroom. The evening was a blur of polite conversation, of faces Olivia had seen 1,000 times, and of photographers snapping shots of them as the ideal couple. Their smiles never wavered. Ethan was the consummate professional, engaging, charming, and ever the perfect partner. But as the night wore on, something unexpected began to happen. Olivia found herself looking at him differently. Not just as a man she had been forced into this arrangement with, but as someone she actually enjoyed being around. The connection between them, once built on obligation, now seemed to have roots that ran deeper. There was something about the way Ethan looked at her, something genuine, that made her question everything. During a brief moment away from the guests, as they walked outside for some air, Ethan took her hand in his. The gesture was small, but it felt like an unspoken promise, like a reminder that they were in this together. "I know this isn't easy," Ethan said, his voice low and sincere, "but I want you to know that I'm here. Whatever this becomes, I'm here with you." Olivia squeezed his hand, feeling a flicker of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. She had spent so long resisting the idea of letting herself care about him, of letting this marriage evolve into something real. But tonight, surrounded by the grandeur of the ballroom, she began to see that perhaps there was something worth fighting for after all. "You don't have to do this alone either," Olivia whispered back, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "Maybe we don't know what this is yet, but I'm willing to find out with you." For the first time in weeks, a true smile spread across her face. Ethan smiled back, and in that moment, Olivia realized that despite all the uncertainty and the pressure of their worlds colliding, they had something worth building, together. And for the first time, it didn't matter who was watching or what anyone expected. What mattered was what they were choosing to make of this. What they were choosing to become. Months had passed since their wedding, and Olivia found herself in a place she never expected, content. Or at least, for the first time, she wasn't entirely suffocating under the weight of expectations. The path they had been forced onto, the path that had once seemed like a suffocating maze of family pressures and business obligations, was starting to open up, offering a glimpse of something new. Life with Ethan had become something different. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. They had found a rhythm, a balance, a way of navigating the complex web of their families, their businesses, and their own fragile hearts. Olivia had long stopped thinking of Ethan as the man she had to marry. Somewhere along the way, he had become her partner, not in the contractual sense, but in the truest sense. They had learned to rely on each other, to trust each other in ways they never expected. But that didn't mean everything was easy. They still had their moments of tension, of unspoken words, of things left unsaid that lingered between them. Ethan was still the driven, ambitious man who had always been, and Olivia, despite her growing feelings for him, still held her independence close to her chest. She wasn't ready to completely give up the fight for her own life, the life she had carefully built before this marriage. One evening, as the city lights twinkled outside their penthouse windows, Olivia sat in the living room, staring at the papers strewn across the table before her. It was a crucial meeting for her own business, and the weight of it hung heavily on her shoulders. But as she sat there, caught between the worlds of her own ambitions and the life she was building with Ethan, she felt a moment of clarity. She felt a moment of clarity She was no longer just the daughter of Gregory Westbrook. She wasn't just Ethan's wife. She was Olivia Westbrook, a woman who had carved out her own place in this world. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't doing it alone. Ethan walked in, his face still serious from the day's work, but his eyes softened when they landed on her. "You're still at it?" he asked, his tone gentle but knowing. Olivia glanced up, offering him a tired smile. "Yeah." Just a few things to wrap up. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her with an expression she had come to know well, a mixture of concern and admiration. "You're doing great, you know," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She looked up at him, her heart squeezing in her chest. "I'm trying," she admitted, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and something more vulnerable. "I just don't want to let anyone down. Not you, not my family. I've always been the one who kept it all together." Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and knelt beside her chair. His hand rested on hers, warm and steady. "You don't have to do it all by yourself anymore," he said softly. "You've never had to. I'm here, Olivia. I'm right here." The weight of his words, the sincerity in his voice, hit her harder than she expected. For the first time in their marriage, Olivia felt something that she had been too afraid to admit to herself. She was no longer alone in this. Ethan wasn't just her husband on paper. He was her partner, the man who had been by her side through it all, quietly supporting her, sharing in her victories and her struggles. She wasn't the only one carrying the burden. They were in this together. "I'm not used to relying on anyone," she whispered, the confession escaping her before she could stop it. "I've always been independent, always had to do things on my own. But now, I don't know. It's not so bad. Not anymore." Ethan smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, and gently squeezed her hand. "You don't have to do it all alone anymore, Olivia. Not if you don't want to." For the first time in a long while, Olivia allowed herself to lean into that truth, to let the fear of losing herself go, just a little bit. She had been so determined to protect her independence, her career, her sense of self, that she had forgotten the value of sharing it all with someone else. "I don't want to," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. And as Ethan leaned down to kiss her forehead, Olivia realized that she had finally found the balance she had been searching for. She could still be Olivia Westbrook, the woman who had worked so hard for everything she had, but she could also be part of something more, a partnership built not just on duty but on trust, love, and shared dreams. Together, they had weathered the storm of expectations, of business deals and family obligations, and come out stronger on the other side. Together, they could face whatever the future held, and for the first time, Olivia allowed herself to believe that they would figure it out, not just for the sake of the business or the marriage, but for the sake of them. She wasn't alone anymore, and that truth filled her with a warmth she never thought she'd feel. As Olivia and Ethan's journey unfolded, it became clear that sometimes life doesn't follow the path we plan. What begins as an arrangement, forced by obligation and circumstance, can unexpectedly turn into something meaningful when we allow ourselves to open up. Their story teaches us that love doesn't always come in grand gestures or from perfect beginnings. It often emerges from the moments of vulnerability and understanding we share with others. Both Olivia and Ethan had to let go of their fears and walls, choosing to trust and support each other despite the weight of their family's expectations. In doing so, they discovered the true power of partnership, one built not on obligation, but on mutual respect and the willingness to grow together. This story also reminds us that it's okay to not have everything figured out. Life is full of uncertainties, and it's through the unexpected twists and turns that we often find the greatest opportunities for personal growth and connection. Olivia learned to embrace the uncertainty and trust in the partnership she and Ethan built, and that allowed them to find happiness in a place they least expected. It's a lesson in letting go of control and embracing the journey, no matter how messy or unpredictable it may seem. So, where are you watching from? And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt tales like this one. Your support means the world, and we can't wait to share more stories that inspire and resonate with you.